They told us WeWork was a technology company. They told us that renting desks to freelancers was somehow worth more than every commercial landlord in Manhattan combined. The market believed it. Wall Street believed it. SoftBank wrote a $10 billion check on the strength of it. By January of 2019, this office sublease business was valued at $47 billion, and the man at the top, Adam Neumann, was being talked about as the next Steve Jobs. But in August of that same year, a single document hit the SEC website and the whole thing came apart in 6 weeks. $47 billion in paper value went up in smoke. SoftBank wrote down $9.5 billion. Thousands of employees lost their stock, and somewhere in a midtown filing cabinet, the lease was still on the books. This is the story of how Adam Neumann burned a $47 billion empire. And it starts, like every collapse, with the people who saw it first. The bondholders. In 2010, Adam Neumann and Miguel McKelvey opened a single co-working space in Soho. The pitch was simple. Lease an entire floor in a Manhattan building on a 15-year contract, divided into smaller offices, and rent those offices to startups on month-to-month terms. Pocket the spread. It was a real estate arbitrage with a foosball table. The model was not new. Regus had been doing it for 20 years. But Neumann had something Regus did not. He had a story. The story was that WeWork was not a real estate company. It was a community. It was a movement. It was, in Neumann's own pitch decks, a technology platform elevating the world's consciousness. The company sold members an idea that working out of a shared building made them part of something larger than a job. And in 2012, 2015, 2017, that story attracted capital at a velocity the real estate industry had never seen. J.P. Morgan put in money. Goldman Sachs put in money. Benchmark put in money. T. Rowe Price put in money. And then in 2017, Masayoshi Son of SoftBank met Neumann for 12 minutes in New York and committed $4.4 billion on the spot. SoftBank would eventually pour more than $10 billion into WeWork at escalating valuations. $20 billion. $47 billion. The number kept going up because Son kept writing checks at higher prices. Each new round set the next floor. Each new floor justified the last. WeWork used the money to do exactly one thing: sign more leases. By the end of 2018, the company had committed to $47 billion in long-term rent obligations across more than 400 buildings in 27 countries. Against those obligations, it had $4 billion in committed member revenue. The math was not subtle. The leases were 15 years. The memberships were month to month. The spread was the whole business, and the spread was negative. The equity investors did not look at the math. The equity investors looked at the story. But the bondholders did look at the math. In April 2018, WeWork issued $702 million in senior unsecured notes at 7 7/8% due in 2025. That coupon told you everything. A 7 7/8% yield on paper from a company Wall Street was valuing like a software firm. The credit market was not pricing a software firm. The credit market was pricing a tenant with too many leases and not enough rent coming in to cover them. The credit market was already pricing the default. 18 months later, the equity market would catch up. If you're still watching, you're exactly who this channel is for. Bondholder is new. We're building this from scratch, telling the stories of corporate collapse from the perspective of the people who saw it coming. The creditors. If that's the kind of story you want more of, hit subscribe. You don't just stay in the loop for the next collapse, you help us keep making these. Thank you. Now, the S1. On the 14th of August 2019, WeWork filed its registration statement with the Securities and Exchange Commission ahead of a planned September IPO. The document was 383 pages long. Inside it, the company disclosed, in plain English, the things that the private market had been allowed to ignore for 9 years. It disclosed that Adam Neumann had personally bought commercial real estate and then leased those buildings back to WeWork. He was the landlord and the tenant. The company had paid him roughly $17 million in rent. It disclosed that Neumann had registered a trademark on the word "we," the single word, and then sold that trademark to his own company for $5.9 million. The board signed off on it. WeWork bought a 2-letter word from its own CEO for $6 million. It disclosed that Neumann had borrowed money against his WeWork stock from the very banks that were underwriting the IPO. J.P. Morgan had lent him hundreds of millions of dollars against shares that the IPO would set the price of. It disclosed that the company's losses had nearly doubled in a year. $883 million in 2017. $1.6 billion in 2018. The losses were not slowing. They were compounding. And it disclosed, in a section the equity press largely ignored, the lease obligations. $47 billion committed, with committed member revenue covering less than 10% of it. The reaction was immediate. Within 2 weeks, the IPO target valuation collapsed from $47 billion to $20 billion. Then to $15 billion. Then to $10 billion. By the 3rd week of September, banks were telling Neumann the deal could not get done at any price. On the 24th of September, WeWork pulled the offering. On the 24th of September, the board removed Neumann as CEO. A month earlier, he had been the next Steve Jobs. Now he was the cautionary tale. But the company itself was not saved by his removal. The company had to be rescued, and the rescue itself was the next disaster. In October of 2019, with WeWork weeks away from running out of cash, SoftBank stepped in with a $5 billion emergency package. SoftBank also paid Adam Neumann roughly $1.7 billion. To leave, $185 million was a consulting fee. $500 million was a personal loan. The rest was a stock purchase at a price that valued the equity SoftBank was buying at multiples of what it would be worth 6 months later. Neumann walked away with more money than most of his employees would earn in 1,000 lifetimes. The employees had stock options that were now worth a fraction of their strike price. This is the moment the bondholders had been pricing for 18 months. The 2025 notes that had been issued at 7 7/8% traded down through the high 70s, into the 60s, into the 50s on the dollar. The yield blew out past 15%. The credit market was no longer pricing risk. The credit market was pricing the timing of bankruptcy. They were sometimes wrong about the year. They were not wrong about the destination. The pandemic accelerated everything. In 2020, office occupancy collapsed. WeWork's members, freelancers, and small startups and corporate satellite teams simply stopped showing up. Many stopped paying. The company tried to renegotiate its leases. Some landlords took the haircut. Many did not. In 2021, SoftBank tried again. It merged WeWork with a special purpose acquisition company at a $9 billion valuation, a fifth of what the IPO had targeted 2 years earlier. The stock traded down from day one. By 2022, it was below $1. The lease obligations the S1 had disclosed in 2019 had not gone anywhere. The pandemic had only made them heavier. The auditors started using the phrase substantial doubt about the company's ability to continue as a going concern. In credit market language, that is a death certificate with the date of death left blank. But beneath the desks, the lease was still ticking. On the 6th of November, 2023, WeWork filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the District of New Jersey. The filing listed roughly $15 billion in assets against roughly $19 billion in liabilities. The largest single category of liability was, predictably, lease obligations. The company petitioned the bankruptcy court for permission to reject roughly 70 lease contracts on the first day of the filing. Within months, it would reject hundreds more. Every rejection was a landlord, often itself leveraged, suddenly holding an empty building and a claim in a bankruptcy queue. The senior unsecured note holders, the ones who had bought the 7 7/8% paper in 2018, were not at the front of that queue. The secured creditors were ahead of them. SoftBank's various positions, restructured and retranched across multiple rescue rounds, were ahead of them in some places and behind in others. The litigation over which dollar belonged to which creditor took months. When the dust settled in mid-2024, WeWork emerged from bankruptcy. The equity was wiped. The old bondholders received a combination of new equity and partial cash recoveries that, depending on the tranche, ranged from cents on the dollar to roughly half. The 7 7/8% notes that had once promised $702 million at maturity had been crushed. SoftBank, the largest single loser of the entire saga, ultimately wrote down more than $14 billion across all of its WeWork investments. Adam Neumann kept his $1.7 billion. Think about that for a moment. The same man whose lease obligations sank the company. The same man who sold his own company a two-letter word for $6 million. That man walked out of the wreckage richer than the people who lent the company money to keep his story alive. The creditors who funded the leases that Neumann signed at valuations Neumann set are the creditors who got paid last and got paid least. The architect of the obligation kept the proceeds. The funders kept the bill. The credit committees at the funds that had passed on the 7 7/8% paper in 2018 had run the math and decided the lease spread did not justify the yield. They were vindicated in bankruptcy court dockets. They had read the indenture. The indenture had told them, in covenant language, that the borrower would commit to long-term obligations against short-term revenue. The covenants were not violated. The covenants were the warning. The bondholders who did buy the paper were not stupid. They were paid to take credit risk, and at 7 7/8%, the risk premium looked acceptable to some desks at the time. What they had not priced was the speed. The collapse from S1 filing to CEO removal took 6 weeks. By the time the credit market repriced, the rescue terms had been dictated by the only party still willing to write a check, which was the same party that had inflated the valuation in the first place. SoftBank rescued WeWork from a hole that SoftBank had spent 4 years digging. That is the mechanism. That is the lease. So where does that leave WeWork in 2026? The company is smaller. The new WeWork operates roughly half the locations it had at its peak, having shed hundreds of leases through the bankruptcy rejection process. The remaining footprint is profitable on a unit basis. The auditors no longer use the going concern phrase. The hybrid work environment that the pandemic created, the one that should have killed co-working, has instead turned out to suit a leaner WeWork reasonably well. Companies that used to lease entire floors now lease co-working memberships for distributed teams. The product, stripped of the technology company pretense and the consciousness-elevating mission, was always a perfectly sensible commercial real estate service. What is gone is the $47 billion. What is gone is the SoftBank capital. What is gone is the equity. What is gone is the trust that the credit market briefly extended to companies that called themselves technology platforms while signing 15-year office leases. The bondholders learned this lesson on time. The equity market learned it 18 months late and paid the difference. And what is gone, conspicuously, is any consequence for Adam Neumann. He kept his $1.7 billion exit. He started a new company called Flow, also in the real estate space, and raised $350 million from Andreessen Horowitz on the strength of the same kind of story he sold at WeWork. The same investors who lit the original match handed him another box of them. We will be telling that story in a later video. The collapse is not always punished. The story does not always end at the bankruptcy filing. Sometimes the story just resets, and the same person walks into a different room and starts pitching again. This is what the bondholders understood from the beginning. The covenants tell you what the issuer is allowed to do. They do not tell you what the issuer will do. The indenture cannot stop a $47 billion lease commitment from being signed against $4 billion in revenue. It can only document the obligation and price the risk. The credit market did its job. It priced the risk at 7 7/8%. The story was that WeWork was a technology company. The math was that WeWork was a sublease arbitrage. The story raised the money. The math sent the bill. The buildings are still standing. The members have moved on. But somewhere in a midtown filing cabinet, the lease is still on the books.